This issue of Japanese history continues from the previous issue, covering the period after the Meiji Restoration. Previously, we explained about the abolition of feudal domains and the establishment of prefectures. This was a major revolution that fundamentally changed the system of samurai control over the land and the people that had existed for over 1,000 years. After completing this reform, the government had passed one pass. They then turned their agenda from domestic issues to foreign policy issues. The first of these problems to be resolved was the unequal treaties that the Edo shogunate had concluded with Western nations. Extraterritorial jurisdiction, which means that Westerners cannot be tried under Japanese law even if they commit crimes in Japan. And in trade between Japan and the West, Japan was granted tariff autonomy, meaning that Japan was not free to determine tariffs on imported goods. This unequal treaty provided for a treaty revision in 1872. The new government planned to revise the unequal treaty during this revision period. Shigenobu Iwakura proposed that high-ranking government officials study abroad in the West to see and feel Western civilization with their own eyes and skin, which was the most important factor for Japan to westernize in the future. In 1971, Hirofumi Ito also advocated the need to study foreign treaties, trade, and regulations in preparation for the revision of treaties coming the following year. Based on these voices, Okubo, Kido, and other key figures in the new government began to think of a plan to send a delegation overseas. At first, they envisioned a small delegation, but as they selected personnel, they gradually increased the size of the delegation. Tomomi Iwakura, a leading figure in the Meiji Restoration and the Lord of Foreign Affairs, was appointed as the ambassador plenipotentiary. Takayoshi Kido of the Choshu domain, Hirofumi Ito, who had studied abroad, and Toshimiki Okubo of the Satsuma domain were appointed as deputy ambassadors. In addition, 107 other promising foreign students and government officials were selected. Iwakura, Kido, and Okubo were the core members of the new government, while Sanetomi Sanjo, Takamori Igo, and Shigenobu Iwakura were the outgoing government officials. In short, half of the core members of the government went on an overseas tour. It was a year and 10 months long. Isn't this a hard situation to imagine? Imagine that half of the key members of the government of the country in which you now live would leave the country and study abroad for almost 2 years. You can see how big a deal that would be. Toshimiki Okubo probably went looking for a model of the political system that Japan should follow in the future. Instead of sending young political officers to study abroad, it was necessary for big politicians such as Okubo and Kido, who are currently engaged in politics, to show a major policy. In November 1871, the Iwakura mission left Japan for its first destination, the United States. Before his departure, Okubo told Saigo and the rest of the absentee government, "Do not undertake any large-scale reforms until we return. And, be prompt in dealing with the aftermath of the abolition of feudal domains." However, Saigo and the rest of the stay-at-home government implemented a series of fairly major reforms. This will be explained later. Upon arrival in the United States, the Iwakura delegation was met with a great welcome there. The other members of the delegation, with the exception of Tomomi Iwakura, wore Western clothes, but Iwakura, who was proud of Japanese culture, landed in the United States wearing Japanese clothes. The great reception in various parts of the United States gave Iwakura and others hope that it might be easy to revise the unequal treaties they had signed with the United States. On March 11, 1872, the first U.S.-Japan meeting was held at the U.S. Department of State. Iwakura negotiated the revision of unequal treaties. Secretary of State Fish rejected the request because Iwakura did not have plenipotentiary powers of the emperor, and therefore could consult but not sign. Yes, even the Japanese leaders still did not even understand the basics of international diplomacy. Hirofumi Ito returned to Japan to pick up the emperor's plenipotentiary powers in order to resume negotiations. The delegation stayed in the United States for 8 months. The delegation then negotiated again, but the results were disappointing. U.S. President Grant said, "You are still too uncivilized compared to Western countries." Japan doesn't even have a parliament. I think it is only when you have a solid foundation as a nation that you can begin to discuss treaty revision. Iwakura and others decided that it would be difficult to revise the unequal treaties and decided to first concentrate on inspecting the political systems, military, industry, and culture of Western countries. They wanted to know why the Western nations were so powerful. They understood that it was the advancement of technology, the rise of trade and industry, and the fact that the people were working without major differences in status. In England, they traveled all over the country, inspecting railroads, communications facilities, coal mines, steel mills, and even beer and cookie factories. They learned that these technological advances were the result of the Industrial Revolution that began only 50 years earlier. The delegation then traveled to France and toured Paris, as well as the Netherlands and Belgium. The mission then traveled to Germany, where it was greatly influenced. It was a meeting with Bismarck, the great man of the time. On March 15, 1873, Bismarck invited the delegation to a dinner party. Here, Bismarck gave them advice different from that of other Western countries. Bismarck said, "You may think that the nations of the world are being courteous to each other, but that is only on the surface, and the reality is that the strong are the strong. Brazil was once a small country, and I will never forget the humiliation of that time. International law states that it guarantees the rights of all nations, but that is a figure of speech. A major power asserts international law if it is favorable to its own country, and if it is unfavorable to its own country, it threatens the other party by resorting to force. It is more important for you to enhance your national strength and independence than to develop a political system that conforms to international law." Bismarck implied that Western nations' refusal to amend unequal treaties on the grounds that Japanese laws did not conform to international law could be easily amended if Japan had a military rationale as strong as that of the West. Okubo was deeply moved by this friendly advice. Germany was a constitutional monarchy, and unlike the US and France, it had much in common with Japan, which had an emperor. Thus, Okubo adopted a major policy of westernizing Japan by following the example of the German political system. Okubo was so moved by the conversation with Bismarck that he wrote to Saigo, "My stay in Germany was short, but it was a great harvest to meet with the great Dr. Bismarck." Germany was a small country, but it rose to its current position through wealth and strong military power. Japan should follow Germany's example. During their stay in Germany, they received a letter from Sanetomi Sanjo, the leader of the rest of the stay-at-home government, stated, "I want Mr. Okubo to return home as soon as possible." What was happening in Japan during their absence of more than a year? Okubo went abroad to tell the absentee government not to make any major reforms, but this was not possible to settle the chaotic period after the revolution. The government in exile pushed ahead with a variety of major policies. Establishment of the school system to promote elementary education throughout Japan. The conscription system was introduced in which commoners were to take on the role of soldiers, which until now had been carried out by warriors. Aritomo Yamagata strongly insisted that a national army was necessary to counter the Western powers, but Saigo, fearing a backlash from the samurai, was reluctant. However, Saigo eventually understood the necessity of such an army, and overrode the opposition that was prevalent in Satsuma and enforced the conscription system. He also promoted reform of tax laws and revised land taxes. Taxes in the Edo period were paid in kind with rice, and the tax rate varied from place to place. The absentee government established a system of land tax reform that required landowners to pay money commensurate with the value of their land. This tax reform was met with great opposition in many parts of the country, and the absentee government was divided in half over one issue. It was the Korean problem. Takamori Saigo strongly insisted on this demand to Sanjo, who in his impatience tried to get Ito and Okubo to return and settle this issue. This issue remained a source of confusion until September 1873, when Okubo and others returned to Japan. To return to the story, the Iwakura delegation left Europe and also had facilities in the Middle East and Southeast Asia. Here, they also sensed the sorrow of Asia, which had become a colony of Western nations. The Iwakura delegation then returned to Japan after a year and 10-month inspection tour. The foreign students and government officials who accompanied the mission would later have a major impact on the modernization of Japan. Okubo then parted company with his ally Saigo and faced political problems. The next article will explain the theory of conquest of Korea. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to our channel and press the like button.